Hello, my name is Tim Sharp and I am Senior Employment Rights Officer with the Trades Union Congress, the umbrella body for 48 trade unions representing 5.5 million British workers. Welcome to the fourth and final video in our series of interviews on employment rights after coronavirus. In the course of this week, we've called on a series of experts to look at labour law, at the implications for technology and work, and at the gig economy. Today, we will be considering what the pandemic and associated shutdown means for the labour market and how trade unions might respond. To assist us, we have Melanie Simms, Professor of Work and Employment at the University of Glasgow's Adam Smith Business School. Professor Simms, who's worked across the UK at institutions including University of Leicester, University of Warwick, University of Kent, Cardiff University and the University of Oxford, is a particular expert on young people in the labour market and worker voice, especially as it relates to trade unions. I'd like to kick this off by harnessing your expertise on the position of insecure workers, particularly younger workers. From what we know about the coronavirus and shutdowns so far, have they been at the wrong side of flexible labour markets?
I think it's a very difficult question to answer until we have good data, and of course there is always a big lag, or a relatively big lag, with labour market data. But what we do know is that there are some sectors where young workers are particularly likely to work, and the two biggest are hospitality and retail, and we know that in both of those sectors they are sectors that have really have moved towards very flexible forms of work, and they've been affected slightly differently by the lockdown and the subsequent furlough packages and things like that. Hospitality, as we know, has largely closed down and is likely to be very taken quite a long time to get restarting. And there, I think there are sort of real challenges about which businesses are going to be able to survive, what kind of packages there are in place, those kinds of things, which will have very big effects on young workers because of the numbers of young workers that work in hospitality. In retail, I think we've got a different set of problems. We know that high street retail has been under pressure for some significant time prior to the crisis. And we know that there are likely to be some insolvencies. There have already been some insolvencies, and there may well be more in future. But obviously there are other areas of retail which are really key sectors, and supermarkets and similar have been really important in getting the rest of us through this process and through this lockdown. There, I think it will depend on business models and which business models are more resilient. We know that sales have, by rumour, dropped quite considerably. So those businesses are going to have to be working out what their new normal looks like. But it's very likely that young workers will continue to be employed in those sectors, in those areas of the labour market in large numbers. Have they been on the wrong side of the labour market? Well, in some respects, yes. We know that pretty much no matter what the cause of any crisis, those with fewest skills and who are the lowest paid tend to take the brunt of that. And young workers, almost by definition, are often in those two categories. But also we know that young people in general are less fearful of the virus for seemingly, for many of them, relatively robust medical evidence that they tend to be less hit, or at least on average tend to be less hit by the virus. And that might create a different dynamic where in fact young workers might be more able to take on some of those frontline work than perhaps those of us who have more health concerns. So it's very early days. It's going to play out very differently in different sectors. And I think even within those sectors, very differently depending on the business models of the individual companies that are providing those services.
Yeah. And so you've sort of detailed some of the significant short-term changes in the labour market. And we also know that something like, between a quarter and a third of the workforce, we think, are maybe on furlough as well. And whole sectors have shut down. We've already seen announcements of big sort of redundancy plans from several employers. But do you think these could lead to long-lasting changes in the labour market?
I think it's almost inevitable that they will. I mean, if we look back over history, we see these kinds of social and economic shocks, as we tend to call them in academic studies, often bring about really big changes in societies and therefore also in labour markets. And if we look back at the sort of last 150 years or so, about how the effects of those big shocks play out in labour markets, one of the things we do know is that the effects on labour markets are really strongly influenced by the institutions that regulate employment. So systems, countries and moments in time where there's been a tendency to sort of bring together the stakeholders to negotiate and work out what moving forward looks like, tend to come out with fairer decision making that spreads risk and that spreads responsibility between stakeholders. And though that's often called social partnership of one form or another. So there are key moments where these kind of shocks have led to the establishment of those kinds of structures as well. And if you look back to the history of countries that have those kinds of arrangements, they've often emerged in these times where some sort of strong external shock has affected the labour market and the economy. And it changes the consensus and it changes the narrative and it changes what the stakeholders want from those political institutions. Whether that happens here and this time is very unclear, however, and it certainly doesn't seem to me to be where the main political narrative is at the moment. But we're also at the very early stages of this. And if you look, at the immediate aftermath of big crisis, it's often not in those first 6 weeks, 8 weeks that we see these kinds of things. It's a build-up of political pressure, social pressure, economic pressure over a period of months and years that creates these kinds of change. So I'm always a little bit sceptical about imagining we should be seeing it now in the immediate aftermath of any crisis. But it is these moments of crisis that does tend to create these very different ways of thinking about how we regulate work, employment, what labour market institutions look like. And I'd be quite surprised if we didn't see some sort of change, whether that's for the better, if you like, for what I would regard as the better, fairer, more equal distribution of risk and responsibility, or whether that's in other directions. I think I'm going to give a very academic answer and say it's too early to tell.
Drilling down into that, I mean, do you think there is a risk, sort of looking at this from a worker's perspective, that employers use this moment to pursue changes to labour market policies that strengthen their hand against those who work for them?
I think we always have to be very attentive to asking the question, whose voices are being represented in those decisions, and what are the structures for representing different interests and different groups and different stakeholders. I certainly I think the part of the issue in the UK is that we have, for a long time now, had a weakening of our institutional regulation of many aspects of civic life, including labour markets. And that does mean that we're starting in a place where employers' voices do tend to be stronger than workers' voices. And I think, we have to take that into consideration as we look at what may or may not happen. But I think it is important that we don't just take that for granted. We don't assume that this is how it always will be, or how in some way it's impossible to change. These structures, these institutions are the outcome of all sorts of tensions and decisions and negotiations and compromises, and external shocks are often those moments where key players can, if you like, reimagine a different kind of system, and I think that's why it's often shocks that lead to these big changes that we see in society. So that can be for good and that can be for bad, but I think we do have to always be asking whose voices are represented, and what are they in whose interests are they speaking? And I do fear that we have a structure at the moment that really does emphasise one set of interests above a broader range of stakeholders. Yeah.
So does that mean, if you think about trade unions, is this in a moment of opportunity for them, given that you probably can make a strong argument they've been more prominent in public life in recent weeks, or given the likely growth in unemployment and what that's going to mean in terms of pressure on wages and perhaps on union numbers, that they actually face an environment that's going to be a lot harder for them?
Well, and I think that's exactly the set of questions that we have to kind of look out for in the coming weeks and months and probably years. My view, very, very definitely and very much informed by academic research, is that the fairest economic and political systems often have their foundations in these moments of crisis, where the three key stakeholders in employment, workers through their unions, employers and the state, come together to work out what moving forward looks like. And that kind of approach, which we call tripartism because it involves the three parties, has the advantage that it gives a strong voice to all of those stakeholders, and it allows them space to work out what's feasible and what's appropriate and what good outcomes look like. But, and it is a very big but, I think, in this context, it requires buy-in from the government and from the state. And I'm not convinced that at the moment that's where the current, particularly government, but also state mechanisms are actually well suited to that kind of development, particularly at UK government level. I live and work in Scotland, and I think there are very different mechanisms which are perhaps better able to bring in a diversity of voices in that process. At the moment, I think the UK has a government that tends to be very hands-off in terms of labour markets and labour market regulation. And it may be this is a moment where that narrative changes, but I certainly don't see evidence of that right now. So I think we do have to be a bit careful about that.
I mean, given that backdrop, what are the sort of options or the strategies that are open to unions as to how they respond to this set of circumstances?
Well, I think like all of us in all of our organisations all across the economy, we have to sort of plan for the worst and hope for the best, don't we? And for unions, I think what planning for the worst might involve being excluded from some of those high-level decisions and really focusing on organising and representing members and workers more generally. And I think that the TUC, you can already see a lot of what the TUC has been doing, has been moving into that space to make the very important point that, you know, returning to work should be something that's safe for workers. And I know the campaign and the narrative today very much has been around that, and it's going to be very important that the TUC and unions keep making that point. I know that as you know, as children, as parents, as workers, as managers, we all have a vested interest in that discussion. But I think we also need to sort of hope for the best and hope for the idea that being involved in decision making and the opportunity for a moment of change and the opportunity to really start to think about what does a more equal representation of all of the stakeholders in work and employment look like, and where can unions be in that conversation. I think we also need to not assume that that's not going to happen, you know, and that there might well be opportunities, you know, perhaps not now, perhaps not in every sector, but in some workplaces, in some sectors, in some moments in time, there are going to be really important conversations to have about what does that look like going forward. And unions are going to be crucial in those kinds of conversations. I know as a union member myself, I'm very, very hopeful that my union will be very active in a conversation with my employer about what does safe look like in my workplace. And we can work that out together. And I know not all workers have that privilege of being represented by an effective union. What I've been most impressed with in the last 8 weeks or so is how quickly so many organisations, my own, the TUC, many unions, have actually been able to change their mode of delivery. And I think what we're going to need to do as we go forward is really think about what bits of that we continue with, where those new forms of communicating, new forms of organising, new forms of negotiation suit us and are things that we want to retain, and where actually we think there's some benefit in sort of going back to some of the previous ways that we were doing things. So I think that period of consolidation is, I don't think unions are alone in that challenge of working out what, and it's become a cliche, hasn't it, this new normal looks like. You know, it's going to be a challenge for all of us as we move forward through the coming weeks. But I'm confident unions are well placed to respond to whatever that next period looks like.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for your time, Mel. I think this conversation has been useful in mapping out the many sort of potential directions that the labour market and the role of trade unions within it might head in the coming, if not months, perhaps years. This is the last in our series of interviews about employment rights after coronavirus. Thank you for everyone who's watched it, and please do give us your feedback. Thank you.